So we're going to discuss some breeding doe differences. The first thing I would tell you that, goats have been very, very popular and very influential in livestock judging contests over the last 10 to 15 years. So the surprise factor, the surprise element should be gone by this point. If you've been to a judging contest before, you've probably judged a class of goats. And even if you haven't, the key to remember is to keep these simple as well. They're not a foreign object. They should be, just placed and evaluated with priorities like we talk about in a lot of our other species. So we're going to get in and discuss some differences here amongst these does. The key factor, again, when we talk about trying to make females, they need to be good at the ground. They need to be good structured first, and they need to have the right type of body shape, the right type of substance and dimension. So as we step in here and kind of evaluate these does, we'll get in behind these does, we'll get in and hopefully get a chest view of these does. But you ought to be able to see some differences amongst this pair in terms of skeletal width and substance. As we look at this doe right here, we can tell that the doe has some skeletal width underneath in terms of being opened up through the lower 1/3 of her body. A doe that's big and bold in terms of her barrel, in terms of her rib cage. I think this doe just breeds with some natural substance, some natural mass and dimension. Relatively stout in terms of her feature, her bone work, her foot size is relatively stout. A doe that's just got some natural width and power. I think as you get off and if you can kind of get off to the side of this particular doe, obviously she's not wanting to act the best in terms of being tied up, but if you just study the shoulder shape of this particular doe, this is maybe where she gets into some trouble. She wants to come apart in her top line. She's a little coarser, more open at the top of her shoulder. Just a doe that needs to balance up better in terms of her look from the profile. So she's got some mass, she's got some substance. Where you'd like to fix this particular doe is from a balance and a structure standpoint. You can see she just comes apart here in her top line, really opens up here at the top of her shoulder blade. This doe that we have here, as we study this particular doe, again, from behind, if that's where you start in terms of width and substance, she's not as wide, she's not as opened up as the doe that we have here to your right. But I think a doe that in terms of having some base width that matches her shape up high does that relatively well. Again, not as big of a rib cage, not as wide and as stout, but I think maybe she matches okay in terms of just her rib and her substance. When you get off to the profile of this particular doe, I think one that balances up relatively well in terms of being really long and clean and angular about her front 1/3, ties her neck in high to the top of her shoulder. A doe that, as you compare her back to the doe that we have over here that we just talked about, she's much more collected, much stronger in terms of her top line, especially right in behind her shoulder. A doe that balances up maybe a little better even out of her hip in terms of her structure from that regard. So definitely some differences here in terms of how that pair of does would get placed. I think it'd be interesting depending on what type of committee you had, if they just went with a notch more performance and size and substance and power in the doe that we talked about first, or if they actually went with the doe that was just a little better structured, a little nicer balanced. And personally, this is probably where I would tend to lie, is if they have enough power, if they have enough substance, they need to balance up more like this. And if you can build them with that type of structural correctness and that type of look, they're probably just considered more complete, maybe a notch higher quality in terms of look. So there's some differences amongst those does. Maybe not a perfect one here in this particular pair, but we'll run a class of does at you here and let you evaluate some breeding does, and hopefully it'll be more beneficial that way to look at a class of does and see how to prioritize them.